Okay, well, I will start then. First of all, a good afternoon to everyone. Warm welcome. My name is David Cannon, and I'm the chair of Jewish Network for Palestine, JNP for short. A warm welcome to all for JNP's third webinar called The IDF and the Israeli Arms Trade. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Shir Hever, an independent economic researcher and journalist, and Professor Haim Bresheeth, a filmmaker, photographer, and writer, as well as a member of JNP's steering group. They're going to discuss the books that each of them has written on the topic, followed by a question and answer. You'll be pleased to know that both their books are available at a discount at the moment. Haim's book is available through Verso, and Shir's book is available through Pluto. So if you go to Verso and Pluto and look up their names, you'll find details there. There is a code for Shir's book, and it's Hever, that's capital H-E-V-E-R, Hever 20. So during the webinar, you are encouraged to submit questions using the chat, which will be monitored by Dr. Les Levido. He's also from JNP's steering group, and Les will select and pass on for me to ask the questions at the end of the webinar. So please do contribute questions. They're always welcome, and we're very pleased to involve the participants as much as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Haim and Shir to introduce their questions. Thank you both.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. So let's get right into it. Haim, my first question for you is about the question of military power. You mentioned in your book how the Hamas party and Hezbollah were able to stand up to the Israeli military, which you call the 5th or 6th strongest military in the world. But how do you measure the power of a military force in terms of personnel or firepower? For example, the Egyptian armies already eclipsed the Israeli military long ago. And if you're considering that the last conventional war that the Israeli army has fought was 47 years ago, how do you measure military strength in the context of asymmetrical conflicts?
I think this is a very, very good question, Shir, very important one. It's best to start by saying that there is no simple, reliable metric for measuring military power of an army. And if there is one, I have never seen it. It used to be that people measured heads or measured tanks or measured fighter jets or developed very, very complex formulations that combined those measurements into some kind of indexing. I think people have given up on this a long time ago, and quite right that they did. The reason is, one of the main reasons is technology. New technology has made it possible for a rather small military force to withstand attacks or defeat rather larger military forces. And that was always the case because it depended on strategy, training, discipline, and so on. So you can't really make calculation based on just military formations. And, I have 3 divisions here and you have 5 divisions, then obviously you win and so on. I think this has never been the case, and it isn't the case now. So maybe we can actually look at performance, if that word is useful, performance in recent military conflicts that the IDF has partaken in. Most of these conflicts were of its choosing and its timing, So this is also part of the measurement. In a sense, those who start the conflict always have the power of surprise on their side. And we've seen this in 1973 very clearly. So I think if we look at the last war in 1973, we have seen that a rather localized attack against the Israeli army has achieved its aims in a very short time because of surprise, because of strategy, which was very brilliant. And both in the north and in the south, the Israeli army fought very hard to retain and to even later gain some territory because of the way that the Egyptians and Syrians have. And I think the book deals with that in great detail. Now, since then, as you say, there was no conflict like this. And the conflicts after that were basically initiated by the IDF against Hezbollah and Hamas in the main. Both in Gaza, in all the attacks on Gaza, which I won't enumerate now, and the attacks on Lebanon in '82 and 2006. Because we haven't got a lot of time, I have to say very briefly that all those attacks failed. How do I know? Well, the IDF tells us that these attacks have failed. They had a number of objectives, and those objectives were not achieved. So by definition, the IDF is admitting failure. So there is no question of the strength of the IDF in those attacks. In both of those attacks in Lebanon, the IDF used more than 100,000 soldiers in the front and many others behind in the supply lines and so on. And in both of those attacks, it wasn't a success. So what does it mean for measurement? I don't know. It just means that we haven't got a sophisticated enough way. And of course, the IDF didn't have a sophisticated enough way of judging its chances for success, because they didn't go into either of those conflicts thinking that they are going to lose. They were sure that they can deliver, and they promised the government when the cabinet gave the go-ahead that they will deliver, and they didn't deliver in both of those cases. In Gaza also, each attack, of course, the numbers were smaller. They didn't use more than 100,000 because you couldn't put 100,000 soldiers into Gaza very easily. It's a smaller theater of war. But Hamas is still there. The jihad is still there. They have more arms and rockets than ever before. And Israel is not capable of controlling them by military force. And they admitted that. So despite all the technology, Israel is probably a leader in technological warfare and technological hardware. Despite this, they are failing in the own mission to subdue and subjugate those smaller and weaker, they're not even armies, they're just forces of volunteers. So I don't know what it means in terms
of technology, if you don't mind, because I think that leads us direct to the next question. When you say that Israel is the leader, is a leader in military technology, almost all of that technology doesn't actually originate from Israel. When we're talking about the weapons themselves, it originates in the United States. And you mentioned, and Israel is the biggest recipient of military aid from the United States in the world. And you mentioned in your book that the Israeli lobby in the United States is the strongest and most capable lobby. Now, I think it's very interesting when we're talking about military strength and how do we measure it. So how do we measure the power of a lobby? One way of measuring it, for example, is the size of the budget. And in terms of the budget, the Israeli lobby in the United States is certainly not the biggest. The US arms company have a much bigger budget. The US oil industry, which also profits from wars in the Middle East, has a much bigger budget. What exactly do you mean when you say that the Israeli lobby in the United States is so capable?
What I mean is, first of all, that the Israeli lobby uses other lobbies as well. The arms lobby in Washington, and I'm sure you know this very well because it's in your book, the arms lobby in Washington is part of the Israel lobby, but is paid by, other people, not by the Israel lobby. So why? Because Israel is more often than not the largest, or definitely always one of the largest clients of the arms lobby in the United States. It is buying American arms, and this is paid for by the American taxpayer, as we know. There's a huge subvention on an annual basis. So the American MIC lobbies also on behalf of Israel, because this is a way of paying itself. It's moving money from the American taxpayer to the Israel budget, the annual budget, the subvention. So the arms lobby in Washington works for Israel, unpaid, but it works for Israel. The oil lobby in the last 3 decades has also been working for Israel, especially as Israel has become a major production in terms of the Middle East, sorry, not the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, production of oil and gas by stealing the oil and gas fields facing Gaza, which should really belong to Palestine. And they did the same thing in Sinai when they used the oil of Egypt. So the oil lobby is also an arm, an unpaid arm of the Israeli lobby. The other thing is, we know that the Israeli lobby is financing almost every single elected representative in the House of Representatives. There is no other country that does this or that can do it and get away with it. And this is not just simply financing, but actually offering support on so many levels it's untrue. And this goes down to the level of state senates and members, representatives of the states, and even to judges, federal and state judges. So the level of support, not necessarily in how much they are being paid, because obviously Israel can't pay them so much like American sources can. But the fact that Israel does that and no other country does it is important. And the last thing I want to say is this. The Jewish community in the United States is the most powerful minority community in the country. How do we measure it? You might ask me. Well, we measure it in different ways. We know the centrality of Jewish people in the different sectors of the American society, the financial sector, the cultural sector. Remember that Jews played an important part and still do in Hollywood and in media companies of the 2000 and following the year 2000. So all these IT giants have a policy which seems to support Israel and also support silencing debate on Israeli crimes and so on. And of course, you know, there isn't another small minority in the United States, and Jews are a small minority after all. You know, it's less than 6 million people, around 6 million, that has so much measurable power in the society. So I think when you take all this into account, no other sector can marshal such forces that the Israel lobby does. And remember that the budget of the Israel lobby is only part of the money that goes into supporting Israel, because a lot of those people, not just Jewish billionaires, with others, are supporting Israel further to this. And we read about this every day. And that's not counted and actually not even known exactly. The sum is never clear. So these are unique features of the Israel lobby that are not shared by any other lobby.
Yeah, well, I have to disagree with you on this particular point, but maybe we can talk more about this in the discussion. And right now, let me move to the next question, which is about the issue of another measurement of military power is the issue of military discipline, and the fact that soldiers are expected to follow orders in a very accurate and prompt way. One of this image in culture, in the media, of the Israeli military forces throughout the years has often been that of a very undisciplined force. If we talk, for example, about the Haganah, you mentioned in the book, in your book, that the Haganah was a disciplined force. When, if you look at the movies that were made on the Haganah and the books that were written, they are often portrayed as a kind of ragtag assortment or a militia with very loose discipline at best. And of course, now we see also with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza that soldiers that are using lethal force, often in direct violation of their orders, get away with it with impunity. And you cannot call this kind of situation an issue of discipline. But what I want to ask you is, do you think that there is a trend in this discipline? Is it going? Is the Israeli military gradually getting more control over its soldiers, or is the Israeli military losing control over its soldiers over time?
I actually think that it hasn't changed. I think it's a question of presentation rather than of essence. The Israeli commander was always the kind that takes initiative with or without a written order. And sometimes they didn't need a written order. We know that in other areas, things happen without written orders. You know, after all, you know, the Holocaust happened without a clear written order. So, you know, you don't need to give written orders, and you also don't need to enforce the written orders in all cases. And this is a tradition of the Israeli army. I mean, the best example of it is the best known one, and that is Arik Sharon. Arik Sharon never followed any order that he got. And that's how he got to be the Israeli, you know, he got to the top of the army. He didn't become a chief of staff because everyone knew that he wouldn't do what he was told. But he became the most revered you know, prime minister in the history of the country, even more than Ben-Gurion. Now, he did all that because it was well known that he will do what he thinks is right, and that is how the IDF ran. The IDF was and is, despite its you know, moniker, is an aggressive force. I mean, Dayan said it many times. And therefore, if the direction of, you know, your action negated an order because you were more aggressive than the order allowed, that was okay. If you were less aggressive, that is a reason for worry. So in the history of the IDF, and I have a lot of detail about this in the book, and many others did also detail this. You know, in 1973, for example, Sharon has acted against orders to cross the canal. And when he crossed the canal, everyone thought he's a genius and everything was forgotten. And this is just one local example of how the system works. Sharon killed every time that he commanded Unit 101, killed people that supposedly he wasn't supposed to kill. But this is a game. The game was, we tell you don't kill civilians, but you know we don't mean it, and therefore we don't have to tell you kill civilians. And this game is being playing now in the West Bank and in Gaza. The people killed in Gaza and in the West Bank are not soldiers. 95% of them are civilians. You know, 10% or more are babies and you know, children less than 5. So, you know, where are the cases? Where are the thousands of soldiers that have been put in to prison because they killed civilians? I think this is a method. This is not a mistake. This is a method of actually speaking softly and walking with a big stick, as the saying was in the United States.
And I think we have to mention that a child of 13 years was killed in the West Bank near Ramallah just yesterday. And my last question for you is also about the question of measuring power. So to complete the picture as much as possible, I want to refer to the concept of courage. You've used the word courage in your book exactly 7 times. 6 times you've used it to describe people who oppose the Israeli military, either through civilian or military action. And 1 time you used it to describe somebody who opposed the Argentinian junta. You've never used the word to describe the Israeli soldiers themselves, even though, again, part of the myth, part of the reputation is that the Israeli soldiers are supposed to be very brave. But do you actually see them as cowards? Do you think that courage was a component in Israeli military strength and then it was lost at some point?
This is a very interesting question, Shir. I would, you know, the 7 times that you counted that I used the concept of courage is probably a very accurate representation of what I think is a courageous action. To oppose the Israeli army without arms and without military power is courageous. Yes, I do think so. And Palestinians and others that you know, oppose it are courageous. I was an officer in that army, and I know that what you did not need as an Israeli soldier most of the time is courage. No army is built on courage. Armies are built on equipment, training, discipline, military doctrine, and of course, planning more than anything, in a sense, strategy and tactics. So that if a soldier doesn't have courage, and most soldiers are not courageous, I would say, everything else is covering up for that. Where does courage come in? Actually, it comes in when individuals are fighting large groups. I've seen the courage in 1973 of Syrian and Egyptian soldiers that stood up against Israeli tanks with a Sagar missile without anything to protect them. You know, the tanks shot at them and they destroyed the tanks single-handedly. This has happened thousands of times. 2/3 of the Israeli tanks were destroyed on the first day. 2/3 of the tanks in the front were destroyed on the first day by individuals, not by attacks by you know, planes and so on. So this is what courage means, you know, to attack when you have no power, no real power to speak of. That's courageous. To be one of 120,000 soldiers going into Lebanon, sitting in a tank, and, you know, to attack 5,000 to 6,000 militias, which have light infantry arms, that is not courageous. That is just the power of occupation. You know, this is what the Wehrmacht did in Eastern Europe. The Russians who stood up with an RPG and shot it against the tank, they were courageous. So that's at least the way I understand courage, and that's how I described it in the book. The children of Palestine, they stand up against the army. Yes, they are courageous because many of them died doing that. Many of them lost their eyes doing that. And they know this. Many of them lost their limbs doing that. Yes, they are courageous.
Thank you, Haim. Do you have questions for me as well?
I do, yes. And I have 4 questions as we asked to, agreed to ask each other. I think it's a very important book that you've written and very complementary to your first book. And I value both books. And, you know, we do have certain disagreements, but I want to ask about things which are much more important than that. Now, the Israeli MIC, and I'm realizing that you don't use this term in the same way, but you know, is basically being a national enterprise, a national asset. That's how it was conceived. A few years ago, and you mentioned this in the introduction to your book, an American company wanted to buy the IAI, which is a very substantial part. It's the aeronautics wing of the MIC, a very substantial part of the whole system. And Netanyahu was a very new prime minister in his second prime ministership. Refused to sell it because it was, he said, a national asset. And indeed, these were national assets. That's how they were built. Last week, they privatized IAI, preparing it for the sale. So this little story is iconic. You know, what has been an asset, a national asset, a crucial national asset for the nation, a nation of soldiers after all, is now just a business to be sold. I wonder if you could speak about the social and financial process that Israel went to from the first position to the second position.
Thank you, Haim, and thank you for the kind words about my book. I also found your book fascinating, and I learned a lot from it. Yeah, just for those of us who are not familiar with the acronym, MIC means Military Industrial Complex. I prefer to use the term military industry because the term military industrial complex already, in the way that Eisenhower coined the term, implies what is the interest of that group of people. He spoke very clearly about a business interest in creating more war and conflict in order to sell more weapons. When the companies are state-owned, it's a bit more difficult to call it a military-industrial complex, I think, because the government itself make a decision to invest in the production of arms. And the government did create IAI, the Israeli aeronautics industry, aerospace industry, it's called now. And now, in a very ironic way, when Lockheed Martin wanted to buy IAI and made a very generous offer for it, and the Israeli government refused out of principled and strategic reasons, now that the cabinet approved to issue the stocks of IAI and to go and try to sell them, it's very unclear who is going to try to buy it. probably not many customers are going to line up to buy IAI because they know that the Israeli arms sector is already being monopolized by another a competing company called Elbit Systems. And therefore, it's very likely that Elbit Systems will remain the only company to make a bid for IAI in order to become a full monopoly and eliminate their final competitor. So, but I think the principal issue here is that indeed the Israeli government created the arms sector with a mind that to solve the problems of the political problems of Israel regarding its neighbors, regarding the occupation, the only solution is through a strong military force. And they adopted that approach because of the generals that became so vocal and dominant in the Israeli political system. So many generals who became ministers and prime ministers. Netanyahu, I think, will be remembered as the prime minister who changed that. Netanyahu doesn't listen to his generals. It's not that he doesn't want to continue the occupation and that he's not interested in suppressing Palestinians. It's that he understands that the fight has gone to a different level, which is not determined by tanks, but rather it is determined with public opinion and culture. And so the arms industry is no longer seen as the most important tool in the government's arsenal. And instead, they say, well, we don't mind if somebody will buy it.
I just want to ask a rider to this. Binyamin Bet-Halachmi wrote a book about the Israel arms industry and mainly concentrated on something that you also concentrate, and that is who Israel sells to and why. And his argument was that Israel used this not just for the purpose that you mentioned, but also for political influence in the third world. It's then at the time sold to more than 100 countries in the third world, and now probably more, I don't know. That the functions were much more complex than the single function you described. Do you not agree?
Yeah, but I think that if in the past it was selling weapons, for example, to the junta in Argentina, because the junta wanted to have heavy weaponry and rifles and the sort of things that allowed them to control the population, today's dictators, authoritarian governments, like in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or in Myanmar, they don't need that kind of technology so much as what they need is, for example, cyber weapons, intelligence technology. And those things are not provided by the generals. They're provided by the private sector, by soldiers who are from the intelligence service. So the generals in the cabinet are no longer able to make their case. You need to have these companies as part of the state apparatus when you already have private companies selling to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, to Myanmar, this kind of cyber technology. So I agree with you. It's a very complex array of technologies and weapons. But the kind that was supposed to be the strategic asset of the state is now not seen as strategic anymore.
Sure, it just is a fact that cyber technology is also where Israel is very strong and very influential. Yeah. Now, the third question is about the incongruous fact of Israel's strength as an arms supplier and exporter. Now, Israel is a very small country, whichever way you look at it. It doesn't have major, mineral wealth apart from the Dead Sea. It doesn't have iron or coal, things that normally helped in heavy industry. And yet, according to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the main research institute on security, in 2007, Israeli military exports amounted to 10% of all military exports in the world. This is something incredible. Whichever way you look at it, it's incredible. This percentage went down somewhat after 2007, but after 2016, it went up again and even surpassed it in 1 year, according to SIPRI. And, you know, it makes a very important part of Israeli exports. So when you are saying that tanks are less important, you're right, but Israel is moving and changing and transforming its export range, and now is exporting not just hardware, but more importantly, software and training and procedural combinations of software, hardware, and training. For example, it is selling to most cities that are using such facilities spying mechanisms on the civilians. This is an area that Israel is specializing in. It is specializing in cyber warfare, as you know, and in hacking. So
I think that maybe you're asking me here actually two different questions. There are two issues that you're covering with your question, because when we're talking about what does it mean for the Israeli economy and how do we interpret the SIPRI reports? That's one thing. Maybe SIPRI doesn't even report on the cyber technology at all. They don't include training in their data. So let's put that aside for a second. And I mean, I've been working with SIPRI for many years about their reports and helped them write what is actually the Israeli arms export. And their methodology is based on the idea of finding first which are the 100 biggest arms companies in the world, and then only focusing on the data they get from these 100 companies. Meaning that if you have in Israel, actually in the 1980s and early 90s, there were hundreds of very, very small companies that never made it into the SIPRI numbers because every Israeli officer with a rank of colonel or higher receives a license to trade in arms almost automatically from the Ministry of Defense. So they can found these tiny companies. Today we have a different situation. Now these colonels find that it's much more useful to work within a bigger company. And if you see a rate of consolidation of these companies, then it creates an illusion as if the Israeli arms export is becoming more important in the world. But actually we have to look at the data a little bit more critically and understand that when we're talking about what is the importance of the arms sector to the Israeli economy, the answer is compared to all other countries in the world, probably no other country in the world has a bigger reliance on the arms exports as part of their export. However, is it the biggest sector of the Israeli exports? Not at all. In the top year, that it was 11% of Israeli exports were arms exports. And that is a lot. 11% is probably more than any other country in the world. But just to remind you, there's 89% of the Israeli exports that were peaceful, that had nothing to do with war. And that was also when the Homeland Security sector was not very developed, this 11%. So we can't say that a big part of that 89% was Homeland Security technology. So let's remember that the internal lobby of the arms industry inside Israel and the importance of the arms workers is very low and diminishing over time. The ability of this group to dictate government policy and to say we need another invasion of Gaza to sell our arms was quite high in 2009, 2008 when the invasion of Gaza back then. But since then, it has taken a serious hit. So now maybe as the final question, I could address the issue of the non-military or the non-conventional arms sector that you asked me about, if that's all right. And then I would say that indeed the Homeland Security sector, which is a newly emerged sector, especially after September 11, the attacks in the United States, is something that Israeli companies immediately tried to exploit and to enter that niche market by saying, we are the experts in that kind of technology, because in fact, we are using that kind of technology against civilians. While the United States sells a lot more weapons of war, the Homeland Security technology is not weapons of war. So that's something that the Israelis say we have more experience in controlling a civilian population, in incarcerating people, in surveillance, in biometric tracking of populations. But even that sector, if we're looking at the offensive cyber, you mentioned that the cyber is a sector where the Israeli companies excel, but they mainly excel because they're willing to cross boundaries that US companies don't want to cross, because it's too dangerous also from a business point of view. Then these companies are taking extreme risks, partially because they're desperate. Black Cube, one of the most famous companies, had a series of very, very controversial projects that they've undertaken to help people, individuals and companies and governments to conduct spying operations. And almost all of these projects failed. But people go to Black Cube because they know nobody else would take on these projects to begin with. And when the customers of Israeli weapons go to the arms fairs after every invasion of Gaza to see the newly developed technology, the new cameras, the new drones, the new missiles, and all the other things that are developed by the Israeli military industry and the Homeland Security industry, they are buying less and less of these products because they're asking a very simple question. Is this technology successful in repressing the Palestinian struggle? Have you developed a technology that can achieve political success? You have a political problem and you solve it with the kind of surveillance technology that we know from the book 1984 by George Orwell. And the answer is no, because the Palestinians are still resisting. There is still a movement, which you call courageous, and I also call it courageous, of people who are not deterred by all of this technology and are continuing to fight for their freedom, even if the Israeli army has more and more technology. So I think that shows that the business model is failing. The hype is failing, and these companies are actually losing money because of it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can we move to the final question? We're running 5 minutes late.
Yeah,
very quick question and a quick answer, please.
I just want to put a short rider to this. You made a very important point that there is a gray zone between security and military exports and production. And for example, drones fall into this area. And Israel was responsible, and these are figures I am taking from SIPRI, between 2001 and 2011, for 10 years of drone production, Israel was behind 41%. This little country was behind 41% of drone production and export. Now, this is an example of things that are not captured by the figures that you yourself admitted are only partial. And that is why I think you have to make more of an allowance for the gray zone when you speak about it.
Question 4.
That was question 4. I think that was the last question. And,
okay.
now just to quickly address this, Ryder, I agree with you, Haim, and just wanted to say that you're correct, of course, and drones have transformed the way that wars are fought. Today, we see many more drones produced by Turkey than by Israel, because they've developed a different concept of how drones should be produced and developed. And yes, these things change all the time, and we need to track them and understand what is the significance of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but we're getting very thorough questions as well as thorough answers. And I'm very keen to share our participants' questions as well. So I really appreciate your expertise. First question for Haim from Pierre Feig. what were the IDF objectives in Gaza in 2014? Essentially against Hamas implanted in a civilian population. Also, what did they expect?
Well, the objections were to wipe out Hamas and Islamic Jihad. These objections were unrealistic, as the questioner points out. These are fish in the sea, in the words of the Vietnamese. You know, they are not soldiers. They don't live in camps. They only wear their uniforms actually when, you know, they go outside as information. Most of the time they don't, and they don't appear as large formations in Gaza or elsewhere. These are basically militias of people that are freedom fighters for Palestinian independence, and they are not to be defeated by armies. And there is a long history of this, and Israel is not different than, say, the American army in Vietnam or the French army in North Africa. It's not possible to do that. So I want to say that, first of all, they set up an unachievable aim, and then they failed to achieve it. Surprise, surprise. Of course, the real aim, the unwritten aim, is to destroy the infrastructure of Gaza. And that they have done in every single attack, to destroy the ability to produce electricity, to destroy the ability to store water and to distribute water, to destroy schools, to destroy hospitals and clinics, and to destroy universities, which they have done, you know. So this is not written in the orders or in the expectations, but it is an important part. So it's not a total failure. If what you want to do, which they do, is to make life impossible for Palestinians as Palestinians in Gaza as Gaza, they have succeeded quite well in each of those attacks. It also shows the amazing resilience of the Palestinian people. I don't think we should be confused by this resilience, because it's going down. I mean, COVID, for example, is undermining their resilience even further, and you can read about this everywhere now. So let's not make allowances for the resilience and think that there's nothing to worry about. They are so resilient, and so let's not make this mistake, please. But the resilience of the Palestinians is amazing when you think what the IDF is doing. So the IDF has not succeeded in destroying the infrastructure of Hamas or the infrastructure of Islamic Jihad, or even the infrastructure of the administration of Gaza. You know, the hospitals continue to work in impossible conditions. People continue to, they don't eat a lot, but they continue to exist. So this is a system which is not perfect, but the IDF has not achieved its aims.
Thank you, Haim. And as they say, existence is resistance. I've got 3 more questions, but before I go on to the next one, please, I do encourage anyone who's got a question to use chat. The next question is for Shir, again from Pierre. Could the speakers scope the importance of military-related production to the Israeli economy, and how significant is trade and investment in military relation production with Britain and UK-based firms, for example, banks?
Right. Over the last 2 decades, more or less, one Israeli company has managed to grow through acquisitions and mergers Elbit Systems and swallow the competition of whole list of smaller companies. Now, Elbit Systems has a business model in which they do not develop any kind of product that could theoretically compete with the United States. So their components are always adaptable to US technology, and therefore US arms companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon have a very strong incentive that Elbit Systems does well and continues to sell their products because they complement US technology. But when we're talking about banks, of course, some banks do invest in Elbit Systems and profit from that company's sales. And the way that Elbit Systems is growing so fast is by increasing their debt. So they constantly need to take more and more loans from banks. Right now, we are in a situation where the global interest rate is quite low because of Corona and because of other reasons. If that will change, then I think many of these banks will discover that they've made a big investment in a company that is very, very leveraged. And it's possible that Elbit Systems will become in danger of bankruptcy if the interest rate goes up. And I think in that moment, the Elbit Systems has nothing to worry about because the Israeli government is going to bail them out. So to go into the beginning of that question, how important, what is the role of that company or this industry in the Israeli economy? It's actually as much a liability as it is a source of income and profit and employment for the Israeli sector. When you look at the long-term trends of different sectors of the economy, the pharmaceutical sector has overtaken the arms sector, the chemical sector has overtaken it, at this rate, I think more and more Israelis don't consider the arms industry to be so essential to the economy as they used to.
Thank you, Shir. Anything to add, Haim?
No, I think Shir is right on the whole. I don't actually think that Israel can abandon, and I think Shir agrees, abandon the MIC companies. So they will, basically refinance them because they still are essential to the IDF, if not to Israel. And the IDF is, I think, quite important in Israel. I think it's more important than Shir would like to believe.
Okay, thank you. And Haim, a question direct from you from Les Levidow. In 1982, Israel's invasion expelled the PLO from the country. In what sense was this a success or failure, and how has it been assessed by the IDF?
I think it was an important success. It wasn't a total success because they wanted to basically physically destroy the PLO, but that was not successful, partly because the PLO has fought incredibly well on the whole. There is a lot of this in the chapter in the book, and I think it's quite clear that they were unable to defeat the PLO as they planned and as they believed they will. Edward Said understood the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon before the PLO itself understood it. He understood and described it very, very accurately, like he described every aspect of Palestinian and Israeli history very accurately. And he said that by being in Tunis, so far away from Palestine itself, they have lost the role of directing resistance in Palestine that they held since its inception. And he was right. The PLO became an exterior force, and though they still launched a number of missions into Israel, these were few and unsuccessful, and they lost their direct contact with the population. And that was a successful of the expulsion. On the whole, the operation was a failure because Israel has not succeeded in its other missions. But the expulsion of the PLO was a severe blow to the PLO.
Thank you, Haim. And a question for Shir, again from Les Levidal. Israel has been exporting security expertise and technology so that governments can better control their own populations as well as wage foreign wars. This export goes back at least to Latin American dictatorships of the 1980s. The security paradigm blurs the distinction between civil and military threats. How has Palestine been a laboratory for such experts, and how have the forms changed over the decades?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that we see the police forces around the world are now presenting themselves more and more as military forces, because this line is blurring, even as military forces are doing the work of police forces. And here, of course, when you have an occupation that lasted for so long in the West Bank and Gaza, where Israeli soldiers operate as police forces, they say, well, yes, we know how an army can act as a colonial police. And this kind of blurred line. You know, those of us who speak Hebrew know that Israel doesn't actually have a Ministry of Defense. This is a wrong translation of the word. The real translation of that ministry is a Ministry of Security, because from the founding of the State of Israel, the distinction between defense and security has been very blurry, and the Israeli military has been used for internal missions, and the Israeli police and internal security agency are used to enforce the Israeli occupation in a foreign occupied land. What does it mean for the exports in most recent years? It means that you see a lot of countries imitating the Israeli model. India has annexed Kashmir, and the Indian consul in New York said, why are you criticizing us and what do you want from us? We're just doing what Israel has been doing for so many years, with a lot of international support. But in order to import the model, you don't have to import the products. You don't have to import even the training and technology. You can import the model just by having a nice public meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and a photo opportunity. But then when the Israeli companies go to India and say, well, are you now going to sign a new contract with us? Actually, they're not having a very easy way of it. And the Indian government, the Indian Ministry of Defense, is putting some restrictions on the Israeli arms companies. One company was blacklisted for 10 years for bribery. And many of the companies that do buy Israeli weapons say, we will buy the weapon, but we're not interested in training. We can do that as well ourselves as you can. And that's the risk when you're making hype into such a big part of your product. You have to convince the customer that your expertise is better than theirs. And who wants to believe that? The customers say, well, we can also oppress. We also know how to control populations. So we'll just buy the bare minimum of the technology, and we'll develop the training ourselves. And I think that's where we see the economic crisis of the Israeli arms industry.
Interesting. Haim, anything to add?
Just briefly, that according to SIPRI, over the last few years, India was the largest client of the Israeli military exports. And at the same time, Israel was the largest exporter of arms into India. So both ways, this is still working. And of course, it's right, they have some problems, but despite that, those figures are still there.
Thank you. Well, that's all the questions. Les, is there anything else you want to ask? Okay. I've got a question coming in. How can knowledge of Palestinian resistance help people everywhere to resist securitization strategies of their own governments? Again, that's from Les.
Can I take that one?
Please.
Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, I think it's very interesting how at the same time that Israel is a symbol for right-wing and authoritarian governments around the world, that they like to say how pro-Israeli they are, whether it's Hungary in Europe or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they, at the same time, the left movements or the anti-imperialist movements all around the world are using Palestine as a symbol. And I think if we look at technology in a very conservative way, that we understand technology as software and hardware of actual products and things, then we get this image as if Israel has all the technology and the Palestinians have nothing and they're just fighting with their bare hands. But in fact, I think the Palestinians are also developing their technology of resistance. There's an arms race, you can call it, between resistance technology, which is not lethal, and oppression technology, which is very lethal. And it's not always that the oppression technology wins. I think one of the best examples of this was during the Great March of Return, which was cut short by COVID-19. That's not because of the Israeli technology. But the Great March of Return, when the Israeli arms companies were expected to develop special drones against that march, Palestinians developed what they called the new F-16, which was actually a fishing net connected to two kites, so it flies up in the air. They had a lot of unused fishing nets because they're not allowed to fish. And they said, we're going to catch drones with our flying fishing nets. Now, they did a video of this and put it online. I think nobody really believed that this fishing net will be able to actually capture a drone. But all the Israeli arms companies said they refused to develop a drone, because if there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that one of their drones will be captured by the fishing net, then that's it. The company is destroyed. It's not a risk they want to take. Nobody will buy their weapons anymore. So I think that is a very interesting example of how by social media action and making a joke about the new F-16, they were able to scare the Israeli arms companies. And what the Israeli military did is they bought these small drones from Amazon that everyone can buy, and attached tear gas canisters to them. So if those drones will be captured by the fishnet or something, then nobody could say it's Israeli technology.
Nice example. Haim, anything to add?
Well, when technology becomes so important, then there's always minimal technology as opposed to maximal technology. So there's the technology of the rich, as Shir has outlined, and there's the technology of the poor. You use a kite, a burning kite, and send it to Israel, and it destroys fields, for example. This has been going on for a long time, and this is not really killing people, but it is causing damage. Hezbollah had incredibly sophisticated low technologies in 2006 of burying its rockets that were low technology rockets compared to Israel. But they were not possible to locate because they thought about it like the Vietnamese, and they hid them ingeniously. And so that the Israeli satellites missed them. And at the point that the Israelis didn't expect, they would lift the cover, send the missile, lower the cover again. It wouldn't be captured on the high technology satellite, and they were ready for another missile. So technology is a double-edged sword, as was said, and they can't really win this all the time. And there is a lot to learn from organizations that work in such conditions, very difficult conditions, and people are learning it.
Thank you, thank you. We're coming to the end. I've got two more questions, so I'm hoping we can squeeze those in. First of all, for Haim, from Gadi Kami, he asks, what does Israel hope to achieve in Gaza? Is this a genocide in your view?
Well, I wish I could answer this. And I don't think there is an answer because, ask yourself if you know the answer. And if you think, what the Israelis are trying to do in Gaza. There are 2 million people in Gaza. So basically, if you read what Israel is doing, is they are going to destroy them because they don't let them live properly. And this is becoming worse and worse. And COVID, of course, is not making it easier. And this is a death trap, you know. Now it is a death trap for 2 million people. So if Israel has a plan for Gaza, we don't know it. There is a group of people that published a plan. These are the extreme right, with the Speaker of the Knesset leading them, by the way. And they suggested that the whole of the Gaza population should be expelled into Sinai. They didn't ask the landlord of Sinai, that is Egypt, if they are agreeing to this, of course, because you don't ask in cases of expulsion ever. But this is the plan of the right, to expel the whole of the Gaza population, to expel parts of the Israeli Palestinian population, that is Israeli citizens, Palestinians, Israeli citizens of the, you know, the so-called Mishulash, the triangle, and to also expel or to come to agreement that most of the Palestinians would live in Jordan. These are not plans as far as I'm concerned, or I hope they never become plans. And these are dreams of madmen. But we know that in history, plans or dreams of madmen have a nature of materializing. So it's either one or the other. It's either making life impossible or expelling them, and making life impossible so that it leads to death and destruction, or I don't know another plan.
Thank you, Haim. Anything to add, Shir?
Yeah, I think the discussions about this in Israel are fascinating. When you have a Minister of Defense, Amir Peretz, back in 2006, who said, if we don't allow the UN to send food into Gaza, then we are going to have to send food into Gaza and pay for it. Right now, the international community is paying for it. That shows, I think, I completely agree with Haim that the Israelis have no plan. They are very confused and different. And if you look at the different political parties and how they approach the issue of Gaza and how it compares between them, you will find that they have no approach to the question of Gaza. And if you look at the platform of political parties, they usually just fail to mention the existence of the Gaza Strip. You have Gadi Eisenkot, the former head of the army, who said no one in Gaza dies of natural causes. So, of course, they're very much aware that they're restricting the quality of life and the quality of water and the quality of health services to the point that people's lives become shorter. But the word genocide is extremely loaded. And the problem is that the word genocide, the UN definition of the word genocide, was formulated by 2 Jewish lawyers after the Second World War, is very, very broad. If you accept the UN definition of the word genocide, then of course it is genocide, but you can also say that what Israel is doing to Palestinian citizens inside Israel would be considered also genocide, because erasing street names is also a form of genocide, which I think is very problematic. I think we should use the word genocide only for cases of mass murder. In this case, I think that the there are many right-wing Israelis who are very hateful and even crazy and wouldn't mind that Palestinians would die in large numbers. But the question, are they willing to pay a price for it? Even Yitzhak Rabin said, I wish that Gaza would sink in the sea. But his solution was not that Gaza would really sink in the sea. His solution was to create some kind of offense and forget that Gaza even exists. And that's not really possible. There is no way to separate Palestine and to partition Palestine according to the Israeli wishes. And the result is that Israelis would have to face the reality that Palestinians do live and exist in Gaza. And I don't think they have the political will to pay the price for attempting to empty Gaza of the people who live there.
Thank you, Shir. So one last question. We're running over time, so brief if you can. This again is from Les Levidow. The BDS campaign targets the arms trade with Israel, where some companies play an obvious role. But perhaps the Israeli security industry has less obvious collusion in the West. How to gain adequate knowledge for comprehensive targeting?
Well, because you mentioned the BDS movement, I want to talk about one part of the BDS, a call, which refers to the Israeli citizens. And in fact, the BDS call says that all of us should try to boycott Israeli products, Israeli institutions, especially those who are complicit in the occupation or in apartheid. But it also says that Israelis are not expected to boycott themselves. What does it? But the call is also addressed to Israelis. What should Israelis do to help promote BDS if they cannot, they cannot stop eating, they cannot stop shopping at their local grocery store? But what they can do is provide this kind of information that Les is looking for. And here, I think there are some very, very important organizations. I want to mention Chamushim, which is an organization, it means armed in English. Chamushim is an organization that collects data about Israeli arms companies and their contracts. And there's one human rights lawyer, Itai Mak, who is day and night launching petitions to the Israeli Supreme Court, demanding freedom of information petitions, demanding to know what are the contracts, who are the customers, who is Israel selling weapons to, and what weapons and how many. And of course, the government refuses to answer him, and the court is not really on his side. But sometimes he does manage to get some information out. And we can just listen to these people, collect this information, and we can learn a lot about the Israeli arms industry.
Thank you. Haim?
I want to say about BDS two things, which I think are important to remember. By the way, first of all, BDS is not against the Israeli arms companies. It's against Israeli companies, full stop. And of course, it's not just against companies in the occupied territories, but against all Israeli companies. Not against Israeli individuals. Never against individuals, exactly like the boycott call for academics is not to boycott Israeli academics, but to boycott Israeli academies, universities, and colleges who are openly collaborating with the occupation and the suppression of Palestinians. So the first thing to remember about BDS is that it is not a strategy. It is a tactic. It is not what is to be achieved, but it is to help the strategy to be achieved. The strategy is the end of Zionist occupation, not just of Zionism and not just of the occupation, but the end of Zionist occupation. In other words, the end of apartheid, the end of racist suppression, and the end of denial of rights to 4 million people. And if you now count the Palestinians inside Israel, more than 6 million Palestinians who have no rights, no political rights, most of them none. And the political rights of Palestinians within Israel are under threat as we speak. And of course, the plans to get rid of those 2 million Palestinians altogether are a threat on their life, not just on their political rights. So BDS is a tactic like the anti-apartheid movement used tactics against South Africa to end apartheid. So what we want in the movement against Zionist oppression is the end of apartheid, not just BDS successes. And of course, this was used by anti-apartheid very successfully, but it took a very long time to come to fruition. And it does take a long time in the case of Israel as well. But just, we should never forget what this is about. It's not about causing harm to Israeli companies. Why cause harm to Israeli companies? That harm is there because they help an apartheid system, and the end of that apartheid system is what all of us should work for. And in that sense, BDS is a preparation, is a political preparation for the populations elsewhere in education, in learning about Israeli oppression, in learning about the Palestinian condition and Palestinian strength as well as a a people, and in bringing about a society in which this apartheid will be impossible for both groups, not just for one.
Thank you both. Thanks to Shir, thanks to Haim for their fascinating, thorough and expert contributions, to Les and the rest of JMP's steering group, and thank you all for joining us.